Everybody like and subscribe, praise the bell icon. Story number 1.
In the summer of 2009, a group of 4 friends, Daniel, Marcus, Lena, and Julia, set out on what was supposed to be a week-long road trip across the American Southwest. They were all fresh out of college, chasing a sense of freedom before real life kicked in. Their itinerary was loose, their spirits were high, and the red horizon of the Arizona desert seemed like the perfect backdrop for adventure. They were headed to a place called Black Ridge Basin, a spot Daniel had found online, remote, untouched, and barely on the map. The road to Black Ridge turned from pavement to gravel, then from gravel to sand. For miles there was nothing but jagged rocks and ghostly silhouettes of cacti. The GPS flickered, then died. Cell service vanished. Still, they pressed on, trusting Daniel's printed directions and a fading sense of direction. They arrived just before dusk, a vast, open desert bowl surrounded by high red cliffs. The silence was absolute, no birds, no bugs, no wind. It felt like they'd stepped out of time. That first night, they made a fire and cracked open some beers, trying to ignore the unsettling stillness. But something was off. Marcus swore he saw a figure standing at the top of the cliffs, just watching. The others laughed it off. Too many horror movies, too much alcohol. But when they looked, the figure was gone. Around 2 a.m., Lena woke to the sound of whispers. She sat up in her tent, heart pounding, and listened. It wasn't the others. She could hear their slow breathing. The whispers were coming from outside. She peeked out and saw nothing but moonlit sand. She decided not to wake anyone and lay back down, eyes wide open till sunrise. The next morning, Julia was gone. Her sleeping bag was still there, half zipped, as if she just stood up and walked off. Her shoes were gone too. They searched the area, screaming her name until their voices went hoarse. There were no footprints, just sand, smooth and untouched. They radioed for help, but got nothing. No signal, no response. By evening, panic had set in. Lena wanted to leave, but Daniel insisted they stay another night. He was convinced Julia had wandered off and would find her way back. That night, no one slept. Around midnight, the whispers returned. This time, everyone heard them. They seemed to come from all directions, soft, rhythmic, like a chant in a language none of them recognized. They huddled by the dying fire, clutching flashlights that barely pierced the darkness. Then they saw the same figure Marcus had mentioned, tall, impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its face a blur of shadows. It stood just beyond the firelight, motionless. Then it started to move, slowly, deliberately, toward them. They screamed and bolted for the car, but the headlights wouldn't turn on. The engine clicked, but didn't catch. The figure was getting closer. Then it stopped, raised one arm, and pointed toward the cliffs. Lena grabbed her flashlight and shone it where it pointed. For a brief second, they saw dozens of figures lining the cliff's edge, all staring down at them. Their eyes were glowing faintly, reflecting the beam. Then the flashlight flickered and died. By morning, Marcus was gone. There was no sign of struggle, just one set of footprints leading out into the desert and vanishing in the sand. Daniel was shaking, muttering that the place wasn't real, that it was some kind of dead land, a place the earth forgot. Lena didn't argue. They packed up what they could and started walking. The car still wouldn't start. They walked for hours under the brutal sun until they came across an old rusted gas station. Abandoned, windows broken, the whole place eaten away by time. But inside, the phone worked. Lena called 911 and managed to give their rough location before the line went dead. When the search party arrived 2 days later, they found Lena half buried in the sand a few miles from the station, dehydrated, delirious, and alone. There was no sign of Daniel, no sign of the car, no trace of Black Ridge Basin. Rescue teams combed the area for weeks, but all they found was sand, rock, and silence. No cliffs, no basin, nothing. When they showed Lena satellite images of the area, there was no trace of the place she described, just endless, empty desert. To this day, Lena refuses to talk about what happened after they left the campsite. But in the rare interviews she's given, she always says the same thing. Some places were never meant to be found. And once you find them, they don't let you leave.
Story number 2.
In 2013, a man named Jason took a solo road trip through the Nevada desert. He was looking for peace and isolation, away from the noise of the city. He'd heard rumors about a forgotten stretch of highway, Highway 44, that cut through the Nevada wilderness, bypassed by most travelers and locals. He was drawn to the idea of finding it for himself, like an adventurer seeking out something that wasn't supposed to be discovered. The road was more desolate than he expected. After a few hours, his car's GPS turned off completely, and the road signs became increasingly sparse, almost as if the highway was intentionally being erased from the map. Jason tried to push on, hoping he'd reach something soon, but night was coming, and the heat of the day was giving way to an unnatural chill. By the time he noticed the faded, abandoned town sign, it was already dark. The town of Hollow Creek was a small, dilapidated place that barely seemed alive. There were a few houses scattered, but most of them looked like they hadn't been inhabited in decades. The streetlights flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. The only thing that seemed alive was a single diner in the middle of town, its neon sign buzzing softly. Jason, feeling a bit uneasy but in need of a meal, pulled into the diner. The door creaked as he entered. The place was empty, save for an old man sitting at the counter. His face was pale, with leathery skin and deep-set eyes. He didn't say anything at first, but Jason noticed he was watching him intently. "Even in," the old man said, his voice gravely. "You lost, son?" Jason shrugged. "I guess you could say that. I'm just passing through." The old man nodded slowly. "Not many pass through here. You sure you want to stay?" Jason felt a chill run down his spine, but he wasn't about to turn back. "I'll be fine. Just some food, please." The man didn't move immediately. Instead, he reached under the counter and pulled out an old, tattered menu. Jason glanced at it. There was nothing on it, just a list of items with no descriptions. The man finally asked, "What'll it be?" Jason hesitated. A burger?" The old man's lips curled into a thin smile, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned around and went into the back of the diner. The place was eerily quiet, the air still, like the town itself was holding its breath. As Jason sat there, the silence seemed to press down on him. He couldn't help but notice how strange it felt. The diner was unnaturally cold, and the flickering neon sign outside cast distorted shadows on the walls. His thoughts were interrupted by a loud crash from the back. The old man's voice echoed through the diner, as though something or someone had fallen. Jason's heart raced. He stood up, about to check on the old man, when the front door slammed open. A tall, thin figure entered, wearing a long, dark coat. The man had no facial features, just smooth, pale skin where a face should have been. Jason froze in place. The figure didn't move toward him at first. Instead, it slowly turned its head toward the back of the diner, and then, with an eerie precision, it began to walk toward the kitchen. Jason wanted to scream, but he couldn't. The old man reappeared, standing silently by the counter once again, as if nothing had happened. "What is that thing?" Jason finally managed to ask, his voice trembling. The old man gave him a sad, almost pitying look. "That's what stays. What's left. They come for us when the sun goes down." Jason didn't understand. "What do you mean?" "The ones that come through, they're not really looking for a way out. They just want to be lost. That's why they end up here." Suddenly, Jason understood. This town, Hollow Creek, wasn't a town at all. It was a trap, something designed to lure the lost and make them stay forever. The strange figure, the cold atmosphere, the lifelessness, it was all part of the same thing. The town was a place for those who got too close to the edge, who wandered too far, and now they were part of it too. Just then, the door swung open again. More figures began to enter, all faceless, all silent. They lined up at the counter, sitting down like it was the most normal thing in the world. Jason tried to leave, but as he approached the door, he felt his legs lock, his body refusing to move. The old man's voice echoed again, calm and certain. "You'll be staying with us now." Jason tried to scream, but his throat was dry, and the words wouldn't come out. The faceless figures turned toward him, their empty eyes boring into his soul. The last thing Jason saw before the darkness overtook him was the empty faces of the others, staring at him with an unspoken understanding. He was one of them now, a wanderer, lost forever. When the sun rose the next day, the town of Hollow Creek was empty again. The diner was abandoned, the door left open. The sign had fallen, barely hanging from its last remaining bolt. No one passing through ever found it again. And if you drive too far off the beaten path, you might catch a glimpse of it. But be careful. The town may start calling to you, asking you to stay.
Story number 3.
In 1996, a young woman named Emily took a job as a summer camp counselor at a remote campsite in the northern woods of Michigan. The camp, called Whispering Pines, was set deep within the forest, far from civilization. It was a place where people came to escape, to reconnect with nature, and to enjoy a peaceful retreat. The camp was old, and many of the counselors who had worked there before warned Emily that it had a strange history, something about the forest being cursed, but she dismissed it as mere superstition. The first few days went by uneventfully. Emily and the other counselors kept the kids busy with nature hikes, canoeing, and campfire stories. But on the fourth night, things started to change. The campers were gathered around the campfire, listening to stories about the local wildlife and legends about the area. Emily was halfway through a story about a mischievous spirit that haunted the forest when one of the campers, a boy named Jake, suddenly interrupted her. "I heard something." Jake whispered, his face pale. Emily chuckled. "It's just the wind, Jake. Nothing to be scared of." But Jake didn't look reassured. He pointed toward the tree line. "No, something's out there." The other kids turned their attention to the woods, but all they could see was darkness. Emily was about to tell them to go back to their tents when she heard it too, a soft rustling in the trees. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, almost like footsteps. The wind picked up, sending a chill through the group. Emily stood up, trying to act calm. "It's probably just an animal," she said, but even she could hear the uncertainty in her voice. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She lay in her cabin, staring at the ceiling, listening to the forest outside. The rustling continued, growing in intensity, but when she looked out the window, there was nothing. No animals, no movement, just the dark trees swaying in the wind. The next morning, one of the counselors, Sam, went missing. His cabin door was found wide open, his bed untouched. The others searched the campgrounds, calling out his name, but there was no sign of him. Panic set in as Emily and the others tried to figure out what had happened. Some thought he had left, maybe gone for a hike and gotten lost. But when they went to search the forest, they noticed something odd. There were no footprints. Over the following days, strange things began to happen. Items would disappear, only to reappear in places where they hadn't been. Counselors started hearing whispers in the woods at night, and some of the children spoke of strange figures watching them from the tree line. Emily tried to stay rational, dismissing it all as a product of fear and imagination. But she couldn't ignore the growing sense that something was terribly wrong. One evening, while walking back to her cabin, Emily saw a shadow standing by the edge of the forest. It was tall and thin, and though she couldn't make out any details, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The figure seemed to watch her for a moment, then slowly retreated back into the trees. That night, Emily decided to go to the camp's old, abandoned chapel, which no one had used in years. The building had always given her an eerie feeling, but she had to know if something, anything, could explain what was happening. She took a flashlight and made her way through the overgrown path that led to the chapel. Inside, the air was cold and stale. The walls were covered in mold, and the pews were long rotted away. But there was something else. On the floor, in the center of the chapel, was a strange symbol carved into the wood. It was a crude design, circles within circles, with lines that seemed to form a star-like pattern. Emily bent down to get a closer look, and that's when she saw it. A small, faded piece of paper stuck to the floor beneath the symbol. She pulled it free, unfolding it carefully. The paper was a note, written in a shaky hand. They never leave. Once they come, they stay. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from behind her. Emily spun around, her heart pounding. The door to the chapel slammed shut, and the temperature dropped sharply. She backed toward the door, fumbling with the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers from the woods were back, but this time they were louder, clearer. They weren't just sounds, they were voices calling her name. "Emily, come find us." Before she could react, the figure she had seen outside appeared in the doorway, standing tall and silent. This time, Emily could see its face, or rather the lack of one. The figure's head was a smooth, featureless mass, like a mannequin's, devoid of any detail. The whispers grew louder, now coming from the figure itself, as if it was trying to pull her in. "Emily, In a panic, Emily screamed and rushed toward the door again. This time it opened. She ran out into the night, not stopping until she reached the main campgrounds. The campers and other counselors were awake, but when Emily tried to tell them what had happened, none of them believed her. They all said she must have imagined it. But Emily knew what she saw. The next day, Emily left Whispering Pines. She didn't even bother to pack her things. She just got into her car and drove, not stopping until she reached the nearest town. When she tried to tell the local authorities about what happened, they only looked at her with blank, knowing eyes. "Happens to all of them," the sheriff told her quietly. "People come and go, but they never leave." Years later, when Emily tried to visit the camp again, she found that Whispering Pines had been abandoned. The area was overgrown, and there were no signs of the old chapel, the cabins, or even the lake. It was as if the entire camp had been erased, swallowed by the forest. Some say the camp is still out there, somewhere in the woods, waiting for the next person to wander too far. And if you listen closely enough, you might hear the whispers calling you home.
Story number 4.
In 2001, a man named Robert decided to take a solo camping trip through the Appalachian Mountains. He was an experienced outdoorsman, and he had spent countless nights alone in the wilderness before. But this time, he wanted something different. He had heard about a secluded area deep in the mountains known only as the Hollow. Few people spoke of it, and the locals always warned against going there. They claimed it was cursed, haunted by the spirits of those who had disappeared in the woods over the years. Curious, Robert disregarded the warnings. He had grown tired of the usual spots and wanted to test his limits. Armed with his gear and a small map he had picked up from a gas station, he set off into the wilderness, determined to find this infamous hollow. The first day of his journey went smoothly. The air was crisp, the sounds of the forest were soothing, and the trail was quiet. By nightfall, he set up camp near a creek, content with the peacefulness surrounding him. But as he settled down to sleep, something felt wrong. There was an uneasy stillness in the air, almost like the forest was holding its breath. Around midnight, Robert woke up to a strange sound, a low, dragging noise, like something heavy was being pulled across the ground. At first, he thought it was an animal, but then it stopped, and then the whispers began. It started faintly, as if the wind itself was speaking. Robert couldn't make out the words, but they were unmistakably voices. They seemed to be calling his name, beckoning him into the woods. He froze, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure if he was hearing things, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Robert, come closer." He tried to ignore it, telling himself it was just his imagination, but the voices weren't going away. In fact, they were now circling his camp, growing closer and closer, as if something or someone was moving around him. Out of instinct, Robert grabbed his flashlight and pointed it toward the source of the noise. What he saw made his blood run cold. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a figure, a man, but not quite. He was tall, his body unnaturally thin, almost skeletal, and his skin was a sickly pale gray. His eyes were wide and black, devoid of any human emotion. The man stood perfectly still, staring at Robert with an unnerving gaze. "Come closer," the figure rasped, its voice a low, guttural sound. Robert stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. He scrambled for his rifle, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching him, waiting. Panicked, Robert turned and bolted into the woods, not caring about his gear or his camp. He ran, not looking back until he reached a nearby ridge. But when he stopped to catch his breath, he realized something horrifying. The forest was silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, no wind. The usual hum of the wilderness had vanished, replaced by a deafening quiet. He checked his map and realized he was completely disoriented. The trail he had been following was nowhere to be found. The woods had swallowed him whole. For hours, Robert wandered through the trees, trying to find any sign of the path or the creek. But the forest seemed endless, and the strange silence weighed heavily on him. Every so often he would hear the whispers again, but this time they weren't distant. They were right next to him, as if the voices were circling around him, just out of sight. At one point, Robert stumbled upon an old cabin, rotted and decaying, its windows boarded up. There was a faint light coming from inside. Hesitant, he approached, drawn by the strange glow. The door creaked open with a push, revealing a dimly lit room. Inside, the walls were covered in strange markings, symbols Robert couldn't understand. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of rot. But it was what was sitting in the corner of the room that made his stomach drop. A figure, hunched over, rocking back and forth. Its face was obscured by its long, matted hair, but Robert could tell it was human, or at least it had once been. It looked up slowly, and when its eyes met his, Robert felt a chill run through him. The figure spoke in a voice that sent shivers down his spine. "They're all gone, you're the last." Before he could react, the figure stood up, revealing its twisted, emaciated form. It lurched toward him with surprising speed, and in a panic, Robert slammed the door shut and ran. He didn't stop until he found himself back at the creek where his camp had been. But when he arrived, everything was gone. His tent, his gear, everything had vanished. The forest around him was eerily silent again, and the whispers had stopped. It was as if the camp had never existed. Robert spent the next few hours desperately trying to find his way out of the forest, but no matter which direction he went, he only found more trees, more silence. He felt as though the forest itself was shifting, trapping him. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Robert stumbled out onto a road. A trucker passed by and gave him a strange look when he asked for help. The trucker didn't say much, but simply told him to stay out of the hollow. When Robert asked what he meant, the trucker only shook his head and drove off. Robert never spoke of that night to anyone, but he knew something dark lurked in those woods. No one who ventured into the hollow ever came back the same, or came back at all. The wilderness had claimed them, and it would claim him too if he ever set foot in those woods again. Years later, Robert would return to the Appalachian Mountains, but he never made it near the hollow. He knew better now, and sometimes when he's walking through the woods near his home, he hears the whispers again, faint but unmistakable. Robert, come closer. And in the deep woods, he knows that something is still watching, waiting for him to return.
Story number 5.
In the fall of 1993, a family of 4, John, Sarah, and their 2 young children, Lily and Ben, decided to move into an old farmhouse in the countryside of Maine. They had heard about the house through a friend who told them it was a great deal, a place to start fresh away from the bustle of the city. The house was secluded, sitting on a stretch of land surrounded by dense forest and rolling hills. The price was right, and the family was eager to begin their new life. When they first arrived, the house seemed to be in good condition, albeit a bit run down. The rooms were spacious, the floors creaked in that nostalgic way old homes do, and there was an eerie quiet that seemed to linger in the air. Sarah, the mother, loved the charm, while John, the father, was more practical, focusing on the repairs that needed to be done. As the days went by, the family settled in. The children loved exploring the vast land, running through the woods, and picking wildflowers in the fields. But it wasn't long before things started to feel off. At night, they would hear strange noises, scratching at the walls, soft thumps, and sometimes distant whispers. John chalked it up to the house settling. Sarah thought it was just the wind, but the children were scared. They often complained of hearing footsteps in the hallway at night when no one was around. And Lily mentioned that she saw a woman's face at the window one evening, though no one else saw anything. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, Sarah woke up to the sound of footsteps outside her bedroom door. Thinking it was one of the children, she got up to check. But when she opened the door, she saw nothing, just the long, dark hallway. The house was quiet. She stood there for a moment, listening, but all she could hear was her own breath. She shook it off, closed the door, and tried to sleep, but the feeling of being watched lingered. The next day, John went into town to pick up supplies, leaving Sarah and the kids alone at the house. After a few hours, Sarah began to feel a strange unease. She noticed that the children were quieter than usual, and they seemed distant, as if something was weighing on them. Lily, the older of the 2, kept staring at the corner of the living room, her eyes wide and unblinking. "Mama? Who's that lady?" Lily asked softly, pointing toward the corner. Sarah turned, but the corner was empty. "What lady, sweetheart?" Lily didn't respond right away. She just stared at the spot, her small finger still pointing. "The lady with the long black hair, she's standing there looking at us." Sarah felt a chill crawl up her spine. She tried to laugh it off, but Lily was insistent. Ben, the younger child, began to cry, clinging to Sarah's leg. Sarah turned on the lights, trying to shake off the creeping dread that had settled in her chest. But no matter what she did, the feeling didn't go away. She could feel something in the house, something old, something that had been waiting. That night after John returned, Sarah shared her concerns. He tried to reassure her, but he too had begun to notice the oddities. The strange noises, the cold spots, the shadows that seemed to move out of the corner of his eye. It wasn't just the house settling anymore. Something else was here. As the days passed, the disturbances grew worse. The whispers became louder, almost intelligible at times, but always just out of reach. John would wake up in the middle of the night to find the door to their bedroom standing wide open, despite locking it before bed. The children started complaining of nightmares. Lily talked about the woman again, saying that the lady wanted to take her away. Ben refused to sleep alone, screaming that there was someone under his bed. One evening, after another restless night, Sarah decided to take a walk through the woods, hoping to clear her mind. She wandered deep into the forest, where the trees were dense and the light barely reached the ground. The air was thick, and the atmosphere felt heavy, as if the woods themselves were alive and watching her. That's when she saw it. Half hidden among the trees, there was an old well, covered in vines and moss. It was nearly swallowed by the forest, but something about it drew her in. As she approached, she heard a low, guttural sound coming from the depths of the well, like something breathing. Her heart raced, but she couldn't turn away. As she peered over the edge, she saw something that made her blood run cold, a pale hand reaching up from the darkness. Suddenly, she was yanked back, her breath stolen by a cold force. A whisper, right in her ear, a voice filled with malice. "Leave or join us." Sarah stumbled backward, gasping, her mind reeling. She turned and ran back toward the house, desperate to get away from whatever she had just encountered. When she arrived, she found John in the living room, pale and wide-eyed. He had been looking through some old documents he had found in the attic and had uncovered something horrifying. The house had once belonged to a woman named Evelyn Hawthorne, who had lived there alone in the late 1800s. According to the old letters, she had been a widow, deeply grieving the loss of her husband. But Evelyn had become obsessed with the idea of reaching out to the other side. She had performed strange rituals in the house, trying to communicate with spirits, desperate to bring back her husband. The records were unclear, but it seemed that during one of her rituals, something went wrong. Evelyn had disappeared without a trace, and soon after, the house was abandoned. The last letter John found described a final warning. "Whatever you do, don't look into the well." Terrified, Sarah and John realized what they were dealing with. The house was cursed, the spirits trapped by Evelyn's dark rituals, and now they were coming for the family. The woman Lily had seen, the one with long black hair, was Evelyn herself. They knew they couldn't stay. That night, they packed up what little they could and fled. They left everything behind, never looking back, and the house sat empty once again, waiting for its next victims. Years later, the farmhouse would be sold again, but whoever moved in would find only one thing: a deep, ancient well hidden in the forest, its stones worn by time, but still calling out to those who dared to listen, and the whispers would return.
Story number 6.
In the winter of 1988, a man named Mark, recently divorced and looking for a fresh start, found himself in need of a place to escape the weight of his own thoughts. He wasn't afraid of being alone, in fact. He preferred it. So when he heard about a small cabin for rent in the isolated mountains of Wyoming, he didn't hesitate. The owner, an old man named Grayson, told him the cabin was perfect for someone looking for peace and solitude. It was far from any other settlements and surrounded by miles of dense forest. Mark, intrigued by the promise of isolation, packed up his things and headed out to the cabin. The first few days were exactly what Mark had hoped for: peaceful, quiet, and disconnected from the outside world. He spent his days hiking, reading, and sitting by the fire, just enjoying the silence. The cabin itself was simple but cozy, with creaky wooden floors and a wood-burning stove. Mark felt comfortable there, though there was one thing that gnawed at him. The place had a strange, musty smell, like something that hadn't been aired out in decades. Grayson had warned him that the cabin had been built a long time ago, but Mark thought little of it. On the fourth night, Mark sat by the fire, reading a book, when he heard a soft knock on the door. It was an odd hour for a visitor, and he wasn't expecting anyone. Cautiously, he opened the door, half expecting to see Grayson, but there was no one there. Just the heavy, still night air and a blanket of snow stretching out beyond the porch. Puzzled, Mark stepped outside, looking around, but there was no sign of anyone. The wind whistled through the trees, but other than that, all was quiet. He turned back to the cabin, about to shut the door, when he heard it, a faint whisper, like someone was calling his name. At first, it was so soft he thought he imagined it, but then it came again, this time clearer. Mark. His heart raced. He quickly shut the door and locked it, trying to shake off the unease creeping up his spine. It's just the wind, he told himself, though he didn't feel convinced. The next morning, he woke up to find that the door was wide open. He knew he had locked it the night before. Mark scanned the room, his eyes falling on the strange marks along the floor. Scratches, almost like claw marks, leading up to the door. A cold shiver ran down his spine. Something wasn't right. That night, as the wind howled outside, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He couldn't explain why, but the air in the cabin felt wrong, thick and oppressive. At around 2 a.m., the knocking came again, soft at first, like a tap on the wood. Mark froze. He knew he hadn't heard the knock the previous night because of the wind or his imagination. This time, it was real. He got up cautiously, moving toward the door, and just as he was about to reach the handle, he heard the voice again, but now it was louder, more insistent. Mark, let me in. The whispering voice was no longer coming from outside. It was coming from within the house. His heart pounded in his chest. He turned slowly, scanning the dark corners of the cabin. And then from the shadows, something emerged. An indistinct figure, tall and thin, moving just at the edge of the light. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The figure didn't have a face. It was just a silhouette, shifting in and out of the darkness, like something that didn't belong. Its body stretched unnaturally, bending in ways that no human form could. Mark could feel its presence, suffocating, pressing in on him. It was closer now, its shape barely perceptible in the dim firelight, but he could feel its eyes on him. The voice, now unmistakable, came again, but this time it was inside his head, echoing like 100 voices overlapping. Mark, let me in. I need you. Frozen in terror, Mark took a step back. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure slowly reached out a long, gnarled hand, and Mark instinctively backed away further. He stumbled toward the door, but it slammed shut, as if it had been pulled from the other side. Panicking, Mark grabbed his rifle and pointed it toward the figure, his hands trembling uncontrollably. "Stay away," he shouted, though he didn't know if it could even hear him. But the figure only stood there, motionless, its face still obscured by the shadows. Just as Mark was about to fire, the door swung open with a violent crash. He turned quickly, heart pounding, to see the figure standing in the doorway now, its presence even stronger. "Mark, you have to come with me." The voice was no longer distant or ethereal. It was real. It was physical. It was right in front of him, and it was beckoning him toward the forest. With all his strength, Mark turned and ran, sprinting out of the cabin and into the snow, never once looking back. He could hear the footsteps of the figure behind him, following him with a horrible determination. He ran for what felt like hours through the thick snow, his breath short and cold in the mountain air. But as he reached the end of the forest, he stopped suddenly, realizing that he had lost track of where he was. Everything around him looked the same: trees, snow, and shadows. He had no idea how he'd gotten so far. That was when he heard the whispering again. It was soft at first, but then it grew louder, circling around him, coming from all directions. "Mark, you can't run from me. I'm already inside." In that moment, Mark understood that the thing chasing him wasn't in the woods. It had been in the cabin all along, hiding in the dark corners, waiting for him. And now it had him. The next day, Grayson found the cabin empty. Mark's belongings were gone, but there were strange marks on the floor, and the door was wide open, just like it had been on the previous night. The snow outside was untouched, with no signs of a struggle. Grayson only shook his head. He'd warned Mark. The cabin, he knew, was cursed, and anyone who stayed long enough would hear the whispers, and once you heard the whispers, you would never leave. To this day, the cabin still stands, isolated in the Wyoming mountains, its door open, waiting for the next person to hear the voice calling them from the dark.
Story number 7.
In the summer of 1999, 3 geology students from a university in Nevada, Tess, Dylan, and Marco, set out on a trip to study unique rock formations in a little-known region of the Mojave Desert. They had found a reference to the area in an old geology journal, mentioning bizarre magnetic fields and impossible stone structures not seen anywhere else. It was remote, off the grid, and not even on most maps. That's exactly what drew them in. They loaded their gear, maps, and satellite phones and drove 6 hours off paved roads into the barren heart of the desert. Their destination was a location referred to in the journal only as Cradle Hollow. Locals never spoke of it. Those who knew of it at all would simply say it was a dead place. Not because nothing lived there, but because some things shouldn't. The first day felt surreal. The desert sun was relentless, but the formations they found were like nothing they'd ever seen. Towering columns of stone twisted into spiral shapes, almost like frozen whirlpools, stood like sentinels in the sand. The compass needles spun in circles, GPS signals blinked in and out, but the students were thrilled. They pitched camp just beyond the rock formations and planned to document everything in the morning. That night, things changed. Tess woke around 2 a.m. to what sounded like whispering outside the tent. She nudged Dylan awake, thinking maybe Marco was talking in his sleep. But when they unzipped the tent, Marco wasn't there. His sleeping bag was still zipped shut, but it was empty. His boots were gone. They called out into the desert, but the only sound that came back was the wind, and faintly a whisper that seemed to repeat Marco's name over and over, like the desert itself was calling him. They grabbed their flashlights and searched the area, finding a trail of footprints that led away from camp and toward the spiral rock formations. They followed them for nearly half a mile until they suddenly just stopped. The footprints ended in the middle of a stretch of flat sand. No drag marks, no signs of disturbance, just nothing. Then Tess's flashlight flickered. For just a second, it illuminated something that made all 3 of them freeze in place. A figure standing at the base of the largest spiral formation. It was human-shaped but impossibly tall and thin, with long arms that almost reached the ground. Its head tilted unnaturally to one side, like it had no bones. They ran. Back at camp, the equipment was dead. The satellite phones refused to turn on. The car, which had worked perfectly earlier, wouldn't even make a sound when Dylan turned the key. They were stranded. The next day, they tried to hike back toward the main road using a compass, but no matter which direction they walked, they somehow circled back to the rock formations again and again. It didn't make sense. They marked trees, stacked stones, even timed their steps, yet somehow they always came back to the same spot. The desert was folding in on itself. That night, Tess heard Marco's voice outside the tent. "I found it," he said. It was calm, almost tranquil. She opened the flap, hoping, praying to see him. Instead, she saw only his silhouette, standing by the rocks, motionless. His eyes reflected the moonlight like an animal's. He smiled, but it was too wide, stretched too far. Then slowly, he turned and walked behind one of the stone pillars. She chased after him, screaming his name, but when she rounded the corner, he was gone. In his place were carvings, fresh, jagged marks etched into the rock. They were symbols, not letters, ancient and angry looking. That was the last time any of them saw Marco. By the 3rd day, Dylan stopped talking. He just stared out at the horizon, whispering to himself. When Tess asked what he was saying, he responded, "They're not rocks. They're not dead." He never explained. The last night Tess remembered came like a fever dream. The sky had turned deep orange. The wind howled, carrying voices that didn't belong to anything human. The ground trembled. She saw the spiral rocks begin to move, slowly rotating like gears in a massive invisible machine. In the center of the formation, a pit opened up. Not a hole in the ground, something darker. It absorbed light. It looked like it breathed. Tess woke up 2 days later in a ranger station, 15 miles from Cradle Hollow. A hiker had found her wandering barefoot, dehydrated, and muttering in her sleep. She had no memory of how she got out. Dylan was never found. Marco's name was scratched into her arms over and over, written in a language no one could recognize. The authorities said it was a hallucination brought on by heat stroke, that they got lost and the desert played tricks on their minds. But Tess knows better. She never went back to the desert. And sometimes when she's alone at night, she still hears that whisper in the wind, calling her back.